1,000 years. Historians call this period the Dark Ages. From the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 to the awakening of Europe in the Renaissance. But if you turn the pages of history, the first thing you will experience is not darkness, but emptiness. A cold emptiness where great changes in society, culture, war, and science seem to have completely disappeared from the timeline. We are told that this era was steeped in chaos, ignorance, and superstition. No one created anything, no meaningful achievements emerged. But have you ever asked yourself how this could happen for almost a millennium on a continent that once produced brilliant minds like Aristotle, Archimedes, and Cicero? And more importantly, who first called it the Dark Ages? None other than the Church. More precisely, those who seized control of knowledge, books, and the collective memory of a fallen civilization. When Rome fell and the secular world collapsed, the Vatican stood as a lone beacon of light for the Christian Church in its early form. But was the light it shed truly meant to illuminate the path, or merely to blind the eyes? Entire libraries, schools, and research centers of the ancient world were burned or cleared in the name of faith. Thousands of manuscripts in Greek, secular Latin, and Coptic silently disappeared from the map of knowledge. Only those texts that had been painstakingly copied into doctrinal Latin, a language accessible only to specially trained monks, were allowed to survive. And those surviving texts were kept nowhere but in monasteries, churches, and ultimately the secret archives of the Vatican. No secular power was strong enough to resist. No independent scholarly system existed to verify the truth. For centuries, Europeans knew only what the Vatican told them about their past. So was the Dark Ages really a time of human backwardness, or was it a manufactured fog created to hide something deeper, darker? Perhaps history wasn't lost, just sealed away. And if so, then the question is no longer what happened, but who wants to never know if it happened at all. Tonight, let's drift along with history as we sleep, in a stream of stories that were never fully told. Because perhaps in those forgotten fragments, we can rediscover a piece of the truth about history, the world, and ourselves. The year was 476. This is the moment that modern history books mark as the death knell of the Western Roman Empire. The son of royal blood, Romulus Augustus, was overthrown by a barbarian general named Odoacer. After a bloodless coup, an empire that had lasted for centuries came to an end. According to today's historians, this event marks the beginning of the Dark Ages. Yet the strange thing is that no one alive at that time called it the fall. No funeral bells rang from the Roman Forum. There was no grand funeral for an empire that had once conquered almost the entire Western world. And even more disturbingly, no one recorded in detail what happened next. You would think that such a monumental event would leave a clear mark on history. Documents, chronicles, memoirs, at least letters or eyewitness accounts. But the strange thing is, the deeper one digs into the 5th to 8th centuries, the thicker the fog becomes. Historical records become fragmentary and hazy, sometimes reduced to mere brief notes from monks written centuries later. It would seem as if the entire continent had fallen into a deep sleep, or someone wanted it to look that way. And then, one name began to surface again and again. Not the emperor, not the scholar, but the church.
The moment Rome departed from the political center, it became the spiritual heart of a new emerging world. The church, once a small, persecuted community, now possessed the kind of power that the Caesars themselves had dreamed of. The power to rule the human soul and its collective memory. Who preserved history in this age? Not the schools. They were extinct. Not the intellectual class. They fled, were silenced or were killed. It was the Catholic monks, the monks who copied religious texts within their monasteries, translated ancient works, and determined what was worthy of preservation. Stories, victories, defeats, everything was filtered through a theological perspective. Even the roles of many of the ancient popes of the post-Roman era, such as Pope Felix III, Gelasius I, or Histus, remain unclear. Did they really exist as recorded, or were they symbolic creations of a time that was largely unverified? Even more astonishingly, between about 500 and 800, the historical record of Europe became so thin that it seemed as if the entire continent had been wiped off the map of history. Meanwhile, in the Middle East and Asia, the records continued to be rich, detailed, and reliable. Why did Europe alone enter a 3-century-long vacuum? The question is not simply what happened, but what was kept, and who had the power to make decisions. Perhaps the fall of Rome was not the end at all, but the beginning of a new system in which power no longer lay with the warriors on the battlefield, but with those who shaped history from the shadows. If you look at the historical landscape of Europe from the 5th to the 10th centuries, you will not see the colors of blood, fire, or progress. Instead, you will see a thin layer of dust covering everything from the great structures that once stood to the memories of its people. There are no clearly documented major battles, no scientific discoveries, no great architectural achievements to emerge from this period. It is as if the entire continent has gone into a deep hibernation. But it was no ordinary sleep. It was as if someone had thrown a heavy blanket over Europe, blocking out the light and erasing memories. Even Milan, Lyon, Cologne, once prosperous cities, left no new traces for centuries. No philosophical manuscripts, no paintings, no new maps, and most strangely, no stories. Those who lived in that era, if they did, left no accounts, or their voices were erased by an invisible hand. Meanwhile, if you look at China during the Sui and Tang dynasties, it was a golden age. Block printing was invented, musical instruments evolved, and poetry reached new heights with masters like Levi and Du Fu. Further west in the Arab world, science flourished. The astronomer Al-Khwarizmi laid the foundations of algebra. The first government hospitals were established, and the Baghdad Library contained millions of ancient manuscripts. And Europe? Europe seemed ignorant of gears, astronomy, even the compass. In a world where the East was ablaze with light, the West seemed to have lost its memory. Who stood to gain from this? The answer lies not outside Europe, but within it. And it has always been there, the calm, steadfast, and increasingly powerful church. When people believed they were living in the Dark Ages, when they were taught that their ancestors had been lost to superstition and ignorance, they did not question. They did not doubt the only truth preached from the pulpit. The word of God was spoken by the mouths of priests. They did not seek knowledge because books no longer existed. They did not seek, but any pursuit of knowledge was considered heresy. The Vatican did not need to be forced by violence. They only had to define one, darkness, and let fear do the rest. In a world without war, without controversy, without innovation, one might assume that nothing had happened. But sometimes prolonged silence is the clearest sign of a hidden crime, the erasure of an entire chapter of human history. History is not just what happened, it is what is told. And when the only voice is left to tell the story of men in priestly robes, that story will reflect not an objective truth, but a carefully selected truth. After the fall of Rome, almost the entire secular scholarly network of Europe collapsed. Public libraries were abandoned. Secular schools closed their doors. Scholars, if they survived, either went into exile or bowed to the church to continue their work. In such a climate, manuscripts were copied and preserved only in monasteries hidden behind stone walls, where, under strict supervision, the light of knowledge was allowed to flow only through narrow gaps. But here are some details that few people notice. Ancient Roman and Greek texts were not simply copied word for word. They were rewritten in Church Latin, a form of language formed by theology, narrow in meaning, difficult to understand, and accessible only to a specially trained priestly elite. While classical Latin once served in the fields of law, literature, and science, Church Latin became the key to locking up the treasury of human knowledge. And this is what happened. The mathematical writings of Pythagoras, the political theory of Cicero, the natural philosophy of Aristotle, if considered incompatible with church doctrine, were reinterpreted or simply not copied. Thousands of works, deemed heretical, pagan, or unnecessary for the salvation of the soul, were burned, lost, or consigned to dark vaults where no one could ever reach them again.
Pope Sabinian and Stephen III, to names like Valentine, Donus II, and even John XIV. Most records about them exist only in documents kept by the Vatican, with no independent confirmation from any source outside the Church. There are no relics, no contemporary accounts, no significant activities recorded, only brief and vague biographical notes. Secular historians are beginning to ask, did these popes really exist, or are they the product of historical reconstruction, filling in the gaps of a time that may have been erased or may never have happened as we believe? Rewriting the list of popes is not simply an exercise in preserving the past. It is a powerful tool for legitimizing current authority. If an 11th century pope wanted to prove that his office was an unbroken line of succession to the first Saint Peter chosen by Christ, the chain could not appear to be broken. The reign of each pope had to serve as a sacred link in an unbroken chain. And if hundreds of years of history were missing, all they had to do was insert the necessary names. It did not stop there. The Vatican has also canonized many figures for whom there is no archaeological or historical evidence beyond legend. These saints are often described as having lived, suffered martyrdom, and spread the faith precisely during periods that are now suspected of being void. It is a coincidence too convenient to ignore. The relics, the bones, and the stories of miracles were revealed in due time, as if created to complete a narrative already written. And in that grand narrative, the Vatican was not just a witness, it was the director. What did this systematic creation accomplish? It created a sacred history and conveyed to the Church a sense of timeless patience and divine authority, a power that could not be questioned because it flowed directly from God through an unbroken lineage.
And so no one dared to ask if a pope had ever been non-existent, how much more history had been fabricated to maintain the illusion of unbroken power. When memory is shaped by belief, and belief is controlled by those who hold history in their hands, the truth, even if it once existed, becomes just one version among many approved by those in control. If there is one thing that cannot be faked, it is the movement of the heavens. A total solar eclipse occurring at a specific location on a specific day can be predicted and verified with near-perfect accuracy, both in the past and in the future. It is a cosmic clock that is immune to politics or belief. And for that reason, astronomy has long been the most powerful tool for verifying historical timelines. But when modern researchers began to compare ancient eclipse records with dates found in European history from the so-called Dark Ages, they discovered alarming discrepancies. Eclipses recorded in ancient Greek, Jewish, or Chinese texts often turned out to be no similar event when cross-referenced with Western historical accounts. Conversely, some historical events claimed to have occurred on the day of an eclipse occurred under clear skies. The discrepancies were not a matter of days, but sometimes lasted decades, even centuries. So what happens when the truth written in the stars does not match the history written on Earth? In medieval Europe, instead of being encouraged to investigate, astronomers were pressured to adjust their calculations to conform to the Church's official timeline. If a celestial event did not fit into the accepted historical framework, it was labeled as erroneous, heretical, or even a satanic ploy. We often forget that the Vatican once dominated the most powerful astronomers in the world. The Vatican Observatory, the Spicola Vaticana, was officially established in the 16th century. But long before that, tracking of celestial movements was quietly conducted and recorded by members of the clergy. These records, never made public, created a private database of changes in time, space, and history. Whoever controlled astronomy controlled the ability to reconstruct the timeline, and so the truth was bent to fit the religious history imposed by the Church. The sky did not lie, but man rewrote what the sky said. Today, modern algorithms allow us to calculate astronomical events with minute precision, and the gaps in European history became more difficult to explain. Events once declared sacred, witnessed by the heavens through an eclipse, leave no real mark in the sky. And the Vatican? They were silent throughout the Middle Ages. Those who dared to look up at the stars and speak the truth that contradicted the earthly narrative of the Church were silenced. Giordano Bruno was burned alive. Galileo was forced to recant, not because they were wrong, but because they had touched the forbidden, real clock of the universe. Once humanity lost the ability to know exactly where it stood in the flow of time, memory became fertile ground for all kinds of myths. And the Vatican controlled the light from the sky, creating what the world would see as eternal darkness. It is often said that for almost a millennium after the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe was plunged into an intellectual darkness. People had no idea how big the world really was. There was no idea of what lay beyond the seas, and of course no accurate maps. But if that is true, where did ancient maps come from centuries before the Renaissance? The problem arises when a particular map does not correspond to the level of knowledge we had during the so-called Dark Ages. The most famous example is the Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513, yet it accurately depicts the coastline of South America. The west coast of Africa, and even part of Antarctica seem to be ice-free. According to Piri Reis himself, this map was compiled from many ancient source maps, the origins of which are still unexplained. How could a map created before the age of exploration depict the world so accurately? How did European Christians have information that was not taught to generations of official history? And the most important question, where are those original source maps? Archaeologists, historians, and independent researchers all point to one place, the Vatican's secret archives, which are buried deep beneath the ground behind layers of access restrictions and prohibitions. The Vatican holds one of the largest collections of ancient maps in the world. Yet less than 1% of this collection has ever been revealed to the public. The rest is sealed, unpublished, unverified, unstudied. And within those fragile sheets of parchment lie geographical landmarks that no one can explain through conventional logic. Coastlines depicted long before the formal discovery of entire continents, islands that no longer exist, mapped voyages that are completely absent from history books, yet perfectly consistent with modern satellite data. This raises a profound question. Was Europe really as ignorant as we are taught? There could have been scholars, priests, and Christians who knew much more, but they were forbidden to talk about it or simply replaced by a sanitized version of history. And if the Vatican holds these maps, what exactly are they protecting? Truth, power, or a version of the world that, if revealed, could shatter the entire fabric of history as we know it? After all, a map is more than just a tool for navigation. This is how humanity determines its place in the world. If you don't know where you are, you can be taken anywhere. And for centuries, the Vatican has held that power. The power to redraw the world and then hide it.
A confused Europe wandering among the ruins of a fallen civilization, this image is etched in the minds of generations after generations. But what if that image is a carefully constructed illusion? The pieces of evidence scattered across Europe raise troubling questions. Intricately crafted bronze gears discovered on German soil are dated to occur within this so-called backward era. Astronomical instruments of astonishing precision have been discovered in abandoned monasteries and underground aquifers. Anti-gravity vaults, geothermal systems found in remote countrysides, places where there is no trace of ancient Roman civilization. Who built them? Who understood how they worked in an era we are told was steeped in ignorance and superstition? Mainstream history calls them anomalies, archaeological oddities. And as usual, when something cannot be explained, it is silently ignored. And in the face of such discoveries, the Vatican chooses silence. Let us not forget, most archaeological excavations across Europe, especially in areas once owned by the Church, have to obtain the approval of local authorities and the tacit consent of the Vatican. In many cases, important artifacts are removed for preservation and never heard from again. A few independent archaeologists have spoken out about this intervention, but they have been sidelined, denied funding, or banned from excavation sites. In academic circles, their claims have been dismissed as conspiracy theorists, even though their findings often threaten to shake the foundations of accepted history. The bigger question is, did Europe really lose everything? Or rather, was some knowledge deliberately hidden to keep the narrative of a dark and ignorant age intact? For a Europe that inherited the light of Rome would be a threat to any institution that sought to monopolize the truth by discovering and understanding what it had discovered. And if you can control the story of backwardness, you can also control who can bring light. The Vatican does not need to lie by remaining silent in the face of evidence that contradicts its narrative. It simply needs to support the story, and sometimes silence is the most powerful form of control. Not all truths are suppressed. Some are preserved but delayed, slowed, their natural progress distorted. And it is in this delay that real power is born. When we look back at the progress of human civilization, a strange pattern emerges. From ancient Rome to the Renaissance, the pace of discovery almost stagnated. A simple mechanism, like the rotating shaft, which the Greeks had mastered, did not reappear until the 13th century. The principles of mechanics, astronomy, and medicine that Aristotle, Galen, and Archimedes had once discovered disappeared, only to be resurrected centuries later as if they were entirely new discoveries. The real question is not why this knowledge disappeared, but who delayed its transmission and for what purpose. Once again, the answer brings us back to the Vatican, which for centuries controlled the vast network of monasteries, schools, and the largest libraries in Europe, the only institution for preserving ancient manuscripts. They had the world's knowledge in their hands, and the point was not that they destroyed it, but that they selectively preserved it, releasing it slowly in carefully measured doses. When a religious power controls not only the soul, but also the flow of history, delay becomes a weapon. A society that simply copies the Bible and doesn't ask any questions will not innovate. A generation that is taught only about heaven and hell does not bother with astronomy or physiology. The lack of innovation for thousands of years does not mean that people were ignorant. It may mean that they were guided by a pre-written historical script. In this way, time itself stopped as an objective flow. It became a tool of control. If you control the timeline, you control both the past and the future. The Vatican did this.
The government controlled history, setting the dates of events, deciding when something would be allowed to remain in the collective memory of humanity. They slowed the awakening not with the sword, but by delaying knowledge. And when the world finally rediscovered what it once was, the Church was there to show the way, as if they had not always hidden it. It was a subtle strategy that required no war, no bloodshed, only the gentle turning of time at the right moment. And in that controlled flow, an entire civilization would move forward more slowly, waiting for the permission of the hand holding the clock. In the heart of the Vatican, beneath ancient stone blocks where sunlight has never reached, lies an ark that is more shrouded in legend than truth. It is the Vatican's secret archive, the Archum Secretum Vaticanum, a place whose very name is enough to send shivers down the spines of scholars wondering what might lie behind its closed doors. This archive is no myth. It is entirely real, but no one in modern history has been granted full access to it. There are no public tours, no detailed interior photos, and anyone wishing to study its contents, whether university professor or international researcher, must endure layers of approval, strict deadlines, restrictions on what materials can be accessed, and no copies must ever be left behind. It is said that inside there are more than 50 kilometers of shelves containing more than 1 million documents from the 8th century to the present day. What the public knows is only the tip of the iceberg. The submerged part, the truly sensitive part, remains invisible. No pope has openly entered every section. No priest has ever revealed its deepest contents, and every detailed map of the archive's layout is strictly classified. Rumor has it that the archive contains original manuscripts omitted from the Bible, secret documents of heretical doctrines and ancient magic, the personal journals of popes from ancient times to the present, things they never openly admit. And most intriguingly, the ancient maps depict the world in a way that is completely different from what we are taught. Yet what makes the Vatican's secret archives so unique is not the amount of documents, but how they are kept secret. Centuries ago, the Vatican defined the word secretum as private, not secret in the modern sense. It was a clever linguistic shield. We are not keeping it secret. We are just keeping it secret. But if what you are keeping secret includes the truth of human history, is it still just an archive? No one knows what is hidden in it, but everyone knows it. If there is any place on earth capable of preserving lost pieces of history, this is it. Not because of its depth, but because of the absolute silence that surrounds it. And when a religious institution has a library that even kings, professors, and scholars cannot freely enter, perhaps the real power rests not on a throne, but on a shelf that no one has ever been allowed to read in its entirety. There are documents that have not been lost, damaged, or destroyed by war, but have only been carefully, systematically, deliberately hidden. Inside the secret archives of the Vatican, according to the scattered accounts of a few scholars with limited access, there are ancient manuscripts dating back to the Middle Ages, even before the birth of the Christian Church. These are not myths. They do not come from distant Eastern lands. They are the product of a body of knowledge that once existed within Europe, and before the light of knowledge was extinguished under the veil of faith. Some of these manuscripts are known to be written in an ancient language that has not yet been fully deciphered, perhaps a Proto-Latin or even pagan Greek. They contain astonishingly accurate astronomical records, anatomical depictions of the human body, and philosophical reflections that transcend the theological worldview that the Church would later impose. Why are they hidden? Because they conflict with the established order. If there was evidence that Europeans had once possessed advanced knowledge, even during the so-called Dark Ages, then the entire narrative of Christ bringing light to a dark world would collapse. If knowledge existed outside the Bible, the Church would lose its claim to sole authority over truth.
That one day the truth would be needed to be told. Today, although some of these texts have been declassified and republished, the Vatican still refuses to acknowledge the doctrinal value of any of them. They remain silent. They invoke sacred tradition. Yet with each passing day, the question becomes clearer. If these texts were truly worthless, why were they so well hidden? Perhaps what the Vatican fears most is that people will not believe these words, but rather that people will start asking questions. And throughout history, every true awakening has always begun with a question that at first seemed innocuous. Not every war is fought on a battlefield. Some wars are much more silent, without swords or shields, yet capable of pushing entire civilizations back centuries. These wars were waged against ideas, where the enemy was knowledge itself. You know, throughout the Middle Ages, and especially during the so-called Dark Ages, anyone who dared to question official doctrine, to explore forbidden topics, even if they were very curious, risked being labeled a heretic. And for that crime, the punishment was never light. One of the most striking examples is Giordano Bruno, philosopher, cosmologist, Dominican priest. He was not a rebel.
He believed so deeply in the greatness of creation that he could not accept that the universe had only one center. He taught that there were countless worlds, countless suns, that God could not be limited to what was written in the scriptures. For these ideas, the Vatican burned him alive in 1600 in the Campo di Fiori in Rome, amidst prayers and the cold silence of the church court. Bruno was one of thousands. Monks who dared to translate ancient manuscripts, researchers of ancient medicine, astronomers, historians, those who touched on knowledge that was not authorized, all risked accusations of heresy. They were tried in secret courts where no evidence was required, only accusations. Punishments ranged from life imprisonment to torture for repentance or burning at the stake to purify the soul. People often call the Inquisition an era of religious terror, but few understand that it was the most sophisticated instrument ever devised to stamp out intellectual dissent. It punished not only individuals, but also ideas. Books were burned, manuscripts were destroyed, truth was extinguished before it could spread. Many works were sentenced to death along with their authors. A book that had taken 20 years to write could be reduced to ashes in a matter of minutes. Even more horrific, the long silence that followed forced future generations to believe that those works had never existed. In such an environment, silence meant survival. Questioning meant death. And over time, silence itself became a kind of complicity, forcing an entire continent to sink into a sleep of knowledge that lasted for centuries. The Vatican, as both a religious authority and a political power, possessed power and as the guardian of knowledge, had no need to prove itself right. It simply needed to maintain control, eliminate those who were too awake, and that was enough to bury the truth in the dark. When we think of medieval monastic orders, we often imagine peaceful monks reading scripture and copying the Bible in remote monasteries. But beneath that serene image was a highly organized network, quiet but far-reaching, operating much like an intelligence agency whose real target was books. From the 8th century onwards, as empires fell, libraries collapsed, and ancient knowledge spread across the land, the Church began a subtle but relentless campaign to collect every surviving manuscript before it fell into the hands of heretics. Who led this campaign? Not the Pope, not the king. The task fell to monks, especially the Benedictines, whose monks were present in almost every major monastery in Italy, France, England, and Germany. The Franciscans, whose primary goal was humility and education, but who also proved adept at reaching out to local communities. The Dominicans, the future enforcers of the Inquisition, and perhaps most powerful of all, the Jesuits proved to be intelligent, cunning, and adept at reaching out to those with absolute loyalty to the Vatican. Under the banner of spreading the faith and preserving religious traditions, the friars were given access to every land, every library, and every scholar known to possess valuable manuscripts. They did not bring swords, but invitations, prayers, and empty purses. From mathematics, philosophy, and astronomy to countless ancient texts, Greek, Roman, Persian, and Egyptian, which were borrowed for preservation and never returned. A century later, entire libraries containing thousands of books, under the friars' care, were reduced to shelves containing only the Bible and its commentaries, whatever was removed or rewritten to fit the doctrine. And of course, the originals were not burned. Burning was barbaric. The Vatican was much more sophisticated. The texts were kept safely away where no one could see them, access them, or even know how many existed. The Vatican's secret archives, the Tade, as we have already seen, became the final resting place for most of these manuscripts. And it was through these quiet, untroubled monastic channels that the Vatican collected not only the faith of the Western world, but also the deepest memories of human civilization. For centuries, these monks were more than priests. They were archivists, censors, and erasers of history, professionals at it. There was no need to destroy, mere possession was enough. There was no need to argue, silence was enough. And as the light of ancient wisdom hid behind stone walls, people began to believe that the world around them was truly dark, because the light was gathered into a lamp by those who would let it burn only when they saw fit.
When the light of knowledge is gathered in one place, and all the rest are forced to live in darkness, the inevitable happens. Some will find a way to keep the light for themselves. Not everyone bows down. Not every scholar is burned at the stake. Some survive, not by betraying the truth, but by hiding with it. And slowly, over generations, a secret network begins to form. Secret societies. There are no official records of when these societies first emerged, but from the 11th to the 14th centuries, their traces begin to appear. Strange symbols carved into churches, mysterious carvings in crypts, extraordinarily sophisticated architectural works that hold knowledge far beyond their era. Among them, most prominent, are the Freemasons. Originally master builders, they evolved into a closed intellectual community rich in codes, rituals, and a complex hierarchy. They built the greatest cathedrals in Europe, yet decorated them with symbols unrelated to Christianity. Suns, moons, eyes, spirals, mathematical ratios. A mysterious brotherhood that possessed the ancient knowledge of Egypt and Babylon, passed down from generation to generation in handwritten manuscripts and layered metaphors. The Church labeled alchemists as sorcerers, but in fact they were chemists, philosophers, and astronomers searching for truth beyond the boundaries of accepted belief. These societies shared a common formula. They did not reject religion, but they did not surrender to it either. They believed that a deep, ancient, and true stream of knowledge existed, predating the religious institutions that later attempted to redefine reality. And most importantly, they suspected that the Vatican had appropriated much of that knowledge and buried it behind stone walls. This is why many Masonic symbols can be read as underground maps, a way of transmitting truth through imagery at a time when spoken words could lead one to the stake. Geometric designs, the letter G, God, geometry, gnosis, or symbols like the compass and the square, all encoded ancient knowledge that only those who were initiated could understand. The secret societies did not openly confront the Vatican, but in the shadows they acted as a balancer. They did not seek to overthrow religious authority, simply to keep the flame of knowledge from going out. And this raises a deeper question. If the secret societies have been able to preserve fragments of truth for centuries, it means that the Vatican cannot control everything. History, no matter how distorted, always leaves its mark. And sometimes those who work quietly on the edge are the ones who hold the last key.
The one thing that can unlock the door to the Dark Ages. When the light of knowledge is concentrated in one place and everyone else is forced to live in darkness, the inevitable happens. Some will find a way to keep the light for themselves. Not everyone bows down. Not every scholar is punished. Some survive by not betraying the truth, but by hiding. And slowly, over time, a secret network begins to form over generations. Secret societies. There is no official record to specify when these societies first emerged, but from the 11th to the 14th centuries, traces of them begin to appear. Strange symbols are carved into churches. Mysterious carvings are carved into crypts. Extraordinary sophisticated architectural works that contain knowledge beyond their era. Among them, the most prominent are the Freemasons, originally master builders, who developed into a closed intellectual community rich in codes, rituals, and a complex hierarchy. They built the greatest cathedrals in Europe, yet decorated them with symbols unrelated to Christianity: the sun, the moon, the eye, the spiral, mathematical proportions. The Rosicrucians, rumored to possess the ancient wisdom of Egypt and Babylon, passed down through generations in handwritten manuscripts and layered metaphors. Alchemists were labeled by the church as sorcerers, but in reality were chemists, philosophers, and astronomers seeking truth beyond the boundaries of accepted belief. These societies shared a common formula. They did not reject religion, but they did not surrender to it either. They believed that a primordial stream of knowledge existed, deep, ancient, and true, predating the religious institutions that later attempted to redefine reality. And most importantly, they suspected that the Vatican had seized much of that knowledge and buried it behind stone walls. This is why many Masonic symbols can be read as underground maps, a way of transmitting truth through imagery at a time when spoken words could lead one to the stake. Geometric designs, the letter G, God, geometry, gnosis, or symbols like the compass and square, all encoded ancient knowledge that only the initiated could understand. The secret societies did not openly confront the Vatican, but rather, in the shadows, they acted as a balancer. They did not simply seek to overthrow religious authority so that the flame of knowledge would not be extinguished. And this raises even deeper questions. If secret societies are able to preserve fragments of truth for centuries, it means that the Vatican cannot control everything. History, no matter how distorted, always leaves traces. And sometimes those who work quietly on the fringes hold the ultimate key, a power that can open the door to the Dark Ages. In every totalitarian regime, control over weapons or wealth is never the ultimate goal. The truest and most permanent form of power is the ability to shape people's thoughts. And to control thoughts, you don't need to brainwash. You just don't have to leave people anything to think about. When history falls into the hands of a select few and knowledge is dispensed drop by drop from authorized pulpits, the minds of the masses gradually empty. They ask questions not because they are forbidden, but because they no longer know what is worth questioning. A vast process of mind control silently takes over in the so-called Dark Ages, exhausting the fuel of knowledge and extinguishing the flame of awareness. In monasteries, monks endlessly copied the Bible, but not the work of Aristotle, Archimedes, or Ptolemy, unless they served a doctrine. In churches, believers were taught about sin, heaven, and hell, but never about social structure, real history, or the power of language. Generation after generation grew up with only one view of the world. They were sinners, and only the church was the key to their salvation. And so ignorance became a kind of faith. Those who knew very little were seen as pious. Those who asked questions were seen as dangerous. Knowledge was no longer noble. It became a sign of arrogance, even heresy. It should be emphasized that this was not natural ignorance. It was planned ignorance, cultivated, maintained, and strictly protected. In many regions, literacy was forbidden to the general public. For centuries, only the clergy were allowed to read. Even monks were denied full access to the Bible. Only those parts were taught that were deemed appropriate. The church did not need to oppress every nation. It just needed to cover the world in a fog of ignorance.
And when you spend your whole life in the fog, you think it is light. That is why the journey to control the mind did not happen overnight. It was a process that spanned centuries, subtle, non-violent, free from force. It only required time, silence. And let no one remember that there was a time, another world, where asking questions was allowed. And the scariest part is this. When ignorance becomes the norm, anyone who knows too much is seen as an outcast.
the world falls into a cycle. And when the Vatican holds both the keys to memory and the future, it does not have to say anything. It just has to be silent, so that we can all live in a dream where truth has been replaced by convenience, and light is something you are only allowed to see when someone allows it. It is a bitter irony that science, born out of curiosity about the life of the universe and the desire to understand ourselves, became a sin during the Dark Ages, a period known as the Dark Ages. A sin that cannot be forgiven, not because science was wrong, but because it was right. When Galileo Galilei peered through his crude telescope and declared that the Earth revolved around the Sun, he was not just making a scientific statement. He was shattering an entire worldview, carefully constructed over centuries, in which mankind was taught that it was the center of the universe, created by God and governed by divine will. A worldview that the Vatican stamped with faith, scripture, and authority. For that declaration, Galileo was put on trial and forced to deny the truth before the Inquisition, not because it was false, but because it threatened the system of control. He survived the whisper, but spent the rest of his life under house arrest, not because he was a rebel, but because he dared to look up at the sky and say what he saw. But Galileo was not the first. Before him came Roger Bacon, the 13th century English scientist who was imprisoned by the Franciscans for pioneering ideas in optics and experimentation. There was Michael Servetus, burned alive for challenging certain dogmas and proposing a theory of the circulation of the blood. And hundreds, perhaps thousands of other scholars, nameless, unwritten, simply erased from collective memory for daring to think differently. The subject was never the subject of science. The subject was the control of truth. When the Vatican declared that all truth must pass through the door of dogma, any theory that did not fit was forbidden to exist, no matter how correct. Medieval universities, many of which were church-run, were not bastions of free thought. They were institutions where students were trained to think correctly, not to seek truth, but to conform to dogma. Ancient scientific texts were kept secret or only accessible to a select few authorized scholars. Knowledge was boxed in. Anything outside the box was heresy. Even more terrifying was the collective fear that arose. People stopped thinking not out of ignorance, but out of fear that one wrong thought might lead them to the fire. And so science became a stranger in the lands where science had once been born. It was only a few centuries later, with the intellectual revolutions of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, that humanity began to shake off the invisible chains that had forced it to bow to the darkness. But by then, how many years had been lost? How many discoveries had been thwarted? How many truths had been killed before they were born? And the most haunting question of all, how many truths were still hidden in the vaults, where no light had yet been allowed to shine?
Imagine an era when people knew how to build complex irrigation systems, built structures long before their time, and could calculate the movements of the stars with astonishing accuracy. And then suddenly, everything would disappear from the timeline. Not because of war, not because of natural disasters, but because it didn't fit the story that those in power wanted to tell. For almost a millennium, from the fall of the Roman Empire to the dawn of the Renaissance, Europe is said to have been in a deep sleep, an era in which there were no major discoveries, no grand constructions, no meaningful scientific advances. A period of history that seemed to have been put on hold. Yet curiously, other civilizations did not sleep. At the same time, China invented the printing press, the compass, and gunpowder. The Islamic world performed surgical procedures, advanced optics, and translated the entire treasury of ancient Greek wisdom into Arabic. India made advances in mathematics, astronomy, and traditional medicine. Only Europe, under the control of the Church, seemed to know nothing.
To be honest, it was not that Europe lacked creativity. Periods of creativity were deliberately erased from collective memory. Inventors, thinkers, architects, they may have existed, may have left their mark, but their work was never recognized, never moved, or worse, replaced with stories of miracles. If such a massive structure had been built, surpassing the techniques of the age, no one would have looked for an engineer. They would have looked for a relic. They would have claimed that a saint had touched the stone and the cathedral had risen overnight. The machines were called gifts from God. Unusual knowledge was attributed to divine revelation. And so miracles became the answer to everything that was not allowed to be answered. That narrative was not harmless. It took away faith in human possibilities. It stifled the desire to question, and it scared future generations to ask, what if miracles were not? Who actually produced these works? What did they know? And why has it never been taught again? In ancient maps, in documents hidden deep in the Vatican's secret archives, many scholars believe there is evidence of this broken time of creativity, strange notations of unknown origin, blueprints beyond the power of the time no one dares to translate. But when miracles are used as an excuse, every question becomes an insult to faith. And so, brick by brick, knowledge was replaced by the fog of doctrine. No one remembers the creators, but everyone remembers the miracle. And in that collective forgetting, power grew stronger. If children grow up in a prison that they think is a school, you don't need chains. If you can control collective memory, you don't need force. Starting with textbooks. For centuries, education was not a tool for enlightenment. This was an expansion of power, especially in medieval Europe, where the Vatican controlled the entire school system. From the content of the lessons to the teaching methods, from the first letters, a child learned concepts they had never been exposed to. A child born into that world was taught that the earth was the center of the universe, that mankind was created in 6 days, that all knowledge was contained in the Bible. And if anything contradicted these sacred words, the fault was not with the text, but with the child. From a very young age, children were taught to believe before they understood, to memorize before they questioned. Critical thinking was not only discouraged, it was considered a sin, because in that system, faith was supreme and obedience was the highest virtue. What children were not taught was even more worrisome to them. They were not taught about other civilizations. They were not taught about Greek science, Islamic medicine, or Chinese discoveries. They were not taught that people could create their own future. Instead, they were taught that all knowledge came from God and through an authorized intermediary, the Church. And this was no oversight, it was a strategy. When a child grew up with a distorted version of history, they not only lacked information, but also lost the ability to admit that they were missing it. They went to church, learned to read, and believed that the world had always been this way, that knowledge was the privilege of the vested, that truth came not from experimentation, but from sacred sermons. Thus, an entire generation became faithful followers of surrender, not religion. The truth never needed to be completely hidden. It was simply replaced with a more manageable version, and ideally instilled in the minds of young people so that they would be strong enough to defend themselves. This is why, even today, parts of history are blurred, simplified, or replaced with myths, not because of a lack of information, but because of an ancient fear that if too many people understood history correctly, they would start asking questions. And when a generation emerges that is capable of asking questions, the K-power begins to crack. When people think of controlling history, they often imagine burning manuscripts, silencing scholars, or hiding secrets in the Vatican's secret archives. But there is a subtler way, quieter, but more effective than any flames lit by the Inquisition. Textbooks. The 19th century, the era of the Industrial Revolution, rising nationalism, and the standardization of education. European nations began to create public school systems, teaching millions of children what they thought was truth. And in the process, history became a political tool. The concept of the Dark Ages was not commonly used in the Middle Ages.
In fact, it was reimagined by European scholars, historians, and religious reformers in the 19th century, which served a very clear purpose of dividing human history and glorifying the present. By portraying the 1,000 years following the fall of Rome as a dark age, the intellectual elite of the 19th century were able to proclaim that their own era was the true age of enlightenment. To do so, they had to turn the past into a collective nightmare, an age of superstition, ignorance, endless war, and complete stagnation. Convenient, right? If you want to celebrate the light, first create the darkest night imaginable before it. But why did the Vatican remain silent when the Middle Ages, the period they once dominated, were portrayed so negatively? Because they didn't have to respond. Over the centuries, through their control over knowledge, they had already left behind a fragmented historical legacy, one that was perfectly worthy of the label of the Dark Ages. And once that label was printed in textbooks, taught in schools, and repeated for generations, it became the truth. The 19th century textbook did not simply record history, it established official memory. From Germany to England, from France to Italy, students were taught a beautiful linear history, from Greece to Rome to the Dark Ages, from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment to the modern era. A neat story, easy to teach, easy to remember, but it ignored much. The forgotten achievements in mathematics, medicine, and architecture in the Middle Ages, the important role of the Islamic world and the Orient in preserving and advancing knowledge, and above all, the deliberate concealment of the Vatican's role in everything, from controlling knowledge to suppressing dissent in the so-called dark formations. Thus, in 19th century classrooms, millions of children grew up believing that there was a time when nothing progressed, when everything was shrouded in superstition. No one taught them to ask why, or who told this story. No professor mentioned secret archives. No textbook questioned the disappearance of centuries of historical records. No one thought that the Dark Ages were a black veil that was smeared on those who wanted to make themselves look whiter and brighter. Have you ever noticed that in almost every movie set in medieval Europe, the sky is always gray? Broken castles, muddy streets, peasants in torn clothes, eyes cast down as if they had forgotten to dream, violence everywhere. Superstition is rampant, and there's always a dark church floating in the background, its huge cross casting a shadow over everyone. This is no accident. Cinema, especially since the 20th century, has become the unofficial historian of humanity. And in the case of the Dark Ages, it has not only retold part of history, it has redefined an entire era. While 19th century textbooks created the concept of the Dark Ages, the media has transformed that concept into an emotional truth. People don't need to read a single document to believe that the Middle Ages were a black hole of ignorance. They saw it on screen. They felt it. They believed it. And herein lies the danger. What we feel strongly we rarely question. Hollywood films like The Name of the Rose, Kingdom of Heaven, Braveheart endlessly recycle imagery from the countless series about witches, heretics, and the Inquisition, a strict church, ignorant peasants, dungeons, and torture. We rarely see advanced Islamic learning centers, sophisticated ancient maps, or the influence of Eastern wisdom on Europe at that time. Why? Because it is much more convenient to describe a dark age in which the Vatican was the only light. It is easy to write. It provides clear contrasts. And most importantly, it completely accepts what those in power have long wanted the public to believe. Once the image of the Dark Ages has been ingrained in the collective memory through movies, comics, games, and documentaries, any attempt to recover the truth begins to feel like counter-propaganda. Those who question are labeled extremists. Those who doubt are seen as weird. Anything that contradicts what we have seen is immediately countered. The reality is this. During the so-called Dark Ages, there were silent advances in agricultural techniques, mathematics, Romanesque and Gothic architecture, and rational thought in monasteries. But such details rarely make it to the screen. And the Vatican, it remains there, sometimes criticized for its dark portrayal, yet at the same time defended as the only beacon of knowledge in an ignorant world. A strange but effective contradiction. So when a child grows up learning from standardized textbooks, using hundreds of hours of media built around the same narrative, at some point history stops being questionable and becomes a complete picture. A picture painted by directors, screenwriters, and patrons behind the camera, not by those who actually lived through the era. And so, truth doesn't die in the dark. It dies under the spotlight. When an institution claims to be the center of truth, the first thing the world has a right to ask is this: let us show you everything we know. But in the case of the Vatican, that has never happened. Over the centuries, the Church has confiscated, censored, and banned thousands of writings, from ancient manuscripts and scientific records to historical documents and writings of old belief systems. Many of these works were placed on the Index Liorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Prohibited Books, an official list that existed from 1559 to 1966. Although that list was eventually scrapped, the reality remains the same. The banned works have not been republished to the public. The question is why? If those writings were truly wrong, let modern scholars criticize them. If they are not harmful, why should they be hidden? And if they simply contain different but dangerous views, wouldn't an enlightened civilization welcome intellectual diversity? But the Vatican has chosen a different path. In the heart of Vatican City lies a place where even the most experienced researchers cannot roam freely. The Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, the Vatican's secret archives. While the word secretum originally meant private, in reality, it meant sealed. Only a small number of scholars are granted access. Each must request specific documents one by one. No photography is allowed, no copying is allowed, and any material that conflicts with church doctrine is kept in the deepest vaults where only a select few can ever step foot. So what is being hidden? Some scholars believe that there are documents that reveal periods of human progress that have been erased from the official timeline. There is evidence of the real influence of pagan, Arab, and Eastern wisdom on early Christian philosophy. And maybe, there are writings that show that many of the truths revealed were actually editorial decisions. The refusal to publish these works is not about forgetting or sacrificing, but rather strategy. Because once those ancient writings see the light of day, the entire historical narrative will have to be rewritten, not just about the Dark Ages, but about the true role of the Vatican in creating the shadows that defined that era. We can't know for sure what is still hidden. But the silence that has stretched over centuries is itself a sign that something must be hidden. No one burns books in the digital age. But if the books are sealed in a vault without a key, what's different than if they never existed? And in the absence of the truth, the official story continues. Taught in classrooms, shown in movies, retold by tour guides in St. Peter's Basilica, where the light shines so brightly, no one stops to notice the darkness below. Modern history often tells us that humanity fell into darkness after the fall of Rome, and then awoke nearly a millennium later to the brilliant light of the Renaissance.
Shouted. It does not need to be repeated 1,000 times. In fact, often what is repeated over and over again, more accurately than in books, arouses doubt. From our earliest days, we're taught that history flows naturally. Rome falls, the world enters a dark age. Then, humanity awakens in the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the modern age. Each era is named, dated, and described by certified historians. Everything seems reasonable, clear, unquestionable. And that is precisely the problem. Because real history is never so smooth. Real history is messy and full of contradictions, gaps, and broken truths. Yet what we learn is strangely smooth, and if you dig deep enough, you will see that there are holes beyond explanation, data missing, truth without evidence. This raises an inevitable question. Has anyone rewritten history, not to deceive, but to manipulate it? And if so, who had the power? Only one group in history has ever controlled all three: knowledge, spirituality, and time. Not kings, not philosophers, not scientists, but the Church. When the Vatican seized entire archives of ancient texts, when monasteries were allowed to copy manuscripts, when ideas that contradicted doctrine were labeled heretical, when time was redrawn by the church calendar, when the past was retold from the pulpit, history was no longer true. It became a tool to shape beliefs, control thought, and above all, to make us forget who we were. Did you know that there are parts of history that scholars now question whether they ever really existed? Events that repeat, timelines that jump around, seemingly cloned images under different names? These are not conspiracy theories. These are serious academic speculations now back on the table.
And if those speculations are true, if what we believe to be history is actually a version edited, staged, divided, and printed in millions of textbooks, then the question no longer remains, are we being lied to? But what is the core truth that we remember? And when collective memory is rewritten long enough, thoroughly enough, it becomes reality. We are born into a reality, grow up in it, and ultimately die believing it, never knowing that it may not be what actually happened. In every civilization, those who ask questions are indispensable. They are the catalysts of progress, the needles that pierce the bubble of consensus, reminding us that no truth is immune to scrutiny. But there is a strange paradox. The more explicitly they ask the right questions, and the more likely they are to be pushed to the edge. In the field of historical research, there is a long list of scholars, linguists, archaeologists, astronomers, even priests who have presented theories that shake the foundations of established timelines. And their results tend to be eerily similar. Dismissed, discredited, cut off from funding, and sometimes disappear. Some are labeled as weirdos, conspiracy theorists. Some suddenly resign without explanation. Some disappear during archaeological expeditions. Some commit suicide before they are ready to publish earth-shattering discoveries. What do they all have in common? They have touched on something that the Vatican is not yet ready to let the world know. Remember, the Vatican itself rarely works directly. They don't need to. A whole system has developed over the centuries: educational institutions, research institutions, publishing houses, the media, ready to silence any voice that strays too far. Even the gaps in historical timelines, the discrepancies in ancient calendars, the absurd maps, the unfamiliar dissenting research on pre-Christian writings almost never appears in mainstream academic journals, not because they are wrong, but because they do not fit into the carefully constructed historical framework. Independent researchers argue that the Dark Ages were a layer of darkness painted over a period of extraordinary progress. Some have shown that the fictional parts of time were filled in by cloning the names of many historical figures. Others claim that the Vatican influenced the entire dating system by adopting the Julian and later Gregorian calendars, which, while seemingly scientific, conceal political preferences. These do not last long in the field. This is no coincidence. It is an unspoken rule in academia. If you touch the forbidden, even if you are right, you will have no place, and that fear spreads like an invisible disease. Those who remain, knowing all too well what happens to those who go too far, learn to be silent, to bow their heads, to write within the norms, until one day censorship is necessary because no one dares to write otherwise.
For more than a millennium, the Vatican has stood tall in the heart of Europe, an untouchable symbol of power, a place where heads of state still kneel, a religious center whose influence transcends borders, regimes, and centuries. But the closer you get to that majesty, the more you sense that something is hidden, not behind darkness, but behind a blindingly bright light. On the surface, the Vatican presents itself as a spiritual leader, a beacon of mercy, a guardian of ancient moral values. Yet at the same time, this institution controls the world's largest archive, where millions of documents have never been made public. Thousands of manuscripts and books deemed heretical have been burned. Historical timelines have been imposed through calendar reforms. The image of the Dark Ages has been created by controlling the only authorized source of light, which remains silent in the face of archaeological, astronomical, and cultural evidence that contradicts established doctrines, and controls collective historical memory to protect its religious power structure. This raises the question: is it the role of a spiritual leader or a gatekeeper of knowledge? Perhaps the Vatican once had its rational reason. Perhaps they believed that humanity was not ready for the full truth.
The image of the Dark Ages has been created by controlling the only authorized source of light, which remains silent in the face of archaeological, astronomical, and cultural evidence that contradicts established doctrines and controls collective historical memory to protect its religious power structure. This raises the question, is it the role of a spiritual leader or a gatekeeper of knowledge? Perhaps the Vatican once had its rational reason. Perhaps they believed that humanity was not ready for the full truth, that social order needed stability, not chaos, which was born of contradictory narratives. That belief was more valuable than information. But belief cannot survive without freedom of choice, and knowledge cannot be preserved in secret. Because if the Vatican truly holds the light, that light should not be locked away under cold stone vaults. If they are true guardians of the truth, then the truth should be shared, not censored. And if the truths the Vatican holds have the potential to reshape human history, then silence is no longer a virtue. It is a sin. No one denies the spiritual role the Vatican has played, but no one should deny it either. When an institution secretly holds vast knowledge, it ceases to act as a mere guide. It becomes a gatekeeper who determines who can enter the past. And when the past is withheld, the future becomes nothing more than a carefully edited version of what they want to believe. History is often compared to a river. But what if someone redirected that river long ago, when we never knew? One of the most controversial theories of modern times, increasingly discussed in independent historical circles, is the phantom time hypothesis. This hypothesis suggests that a large part of medieval European history was deliberately inserted so that about 297 years never actually happened, including most of what we call the Dark Ages. And if that's true, then the current year is not 2025, but perhaps just 1725. Sounds impossible? Let's examine the arguments. First, there is very little solid archaeological evidence, written records, or verified artifacts for many of the events that occurred between 600 and 900. Much of the history of this period relies entirely on records written or rewritten by the Church. Second, astronomical events, eclipses, comets, planetary cycles, are not consistent with medieval timelines. When modern astronomers cross-reference these events using simulation software, they find discrepancies of hundreds of years in some cases. Third, historical figures seem to be eerily similar, appearing under different names in nearby dynasties, yet having nearly identical descriptions, behaviors, and roles. Is this an attempt to fill in time by coincidence, or an attempt to fill in an artificially created timeline? Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, who benefits from adding nearly 300 phantom years to the timeline? The answer again takes us back to a familiar place, the Vatican. By creating the timeline, the Church not only gave its power structure the illusion of ancient longevity, it also created a safe distance between the fall of Rome and the modern era. If people believed they had emerged from the millennium of darkness, they were less likely to question their narrative.
Some ancient texts even used the Anno Mundi calendar, which counted from the creation of the world, and the Byzantine calendar, both of which marked time differently than today's system. The later change to the Gregorian calendar created further confusion in dating events. So who can say for sure that our current year count is correct? If the full truth that has been suppressed for centuries is revealed, the year 2025 could be a few hundred years off, not in terms of technological or social progress, but in terms of the accuracy of our timeline. Now imagine we live in a modern world where AI is exploring space, yet the foundation of our timeline could be flawed. And if time is the framework that defines history, when time itself is wrong, then all of human history would have to be rewritten. No one can say for sure what the truth is, but as more questions arise, one thing becomes increasingly clear. We don't really know where we are, because we will probably never know where we came from. We are born into a world of names, dates, and stories that have already been written. We open our eyes in 2025, where there are books about the history of the fall of thousands of years ago, the rise of kings, the revolutions that shaped the world, and we believe because no one wants to start their lives wondering where am I if what I already know could be wrong. But within the smooth flow of history, there are some cracks, some gaps, some things that don't add up. And every time we touch one of those cracks, history becomes a thick door that is only cracked open, just enough to see that perhaps someone once stood here before us, but their name was erased. We talk about progress, but if the beginning of this journey has been rewritten, hidden, or worse, invented, then we no longer know how far we have really come. We no longer know whether we are living the real day of the story or whether we are simply rereading an old script with a new thought. And when we forget the real past, we lose more than memory. We lose the power to shape the future. So if there is anything more dangerous than forgetting, it is forgetting by design. History does not require you to believe it, it simply requires you to ask it again. And if this journey forces you to ask questions that once seemed obvious, then perhaps you have taken your first step toward a truth that has been hidden for a long time.
Consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss our next foray. Thanks for spending your time here, and until next time, stay curious and stay safe.